Hey, this is Darren, head of remote at GitLab, and today I'm being joined by our CEO and co-founder, Sid, and we're going to talk about company values and the culture that's derived from that. So GitLab's values are very unique, and the way that they are revered and respected here is also really unique. And especially for new hires, if you're coming from an organization where values may have just been words on a wall, or they were only used to support certain agendas, or they were really only applicable at certain seniority levels, entering into this organization can be a bit jarring, and you'll see values brought up in day-to-day tasks and in day-to-day decision making. And especially as GitLab scales, it's really important that new hires get a firm understanding of our values and recognize that they actually matter, and they give themselves permission to do things differently. That's how the culture will scale as the quantity of team members here scales. So I wanted to grab Sid today and ask him some questions about values, learn a bit about their inception and how they've evolved and where he sees them going forward. So first of all, Sid, thank you very much for taking the time to do this.
Thanks, Darren, for helping to get this communicated.
Absolutely. So let's start at the beginning. Were all 6 of GitLab's values documented at inception, or have they evolved over time?
They've evolved and they're still evolving. Our values page is a living document. In the beginning, we had no documented values. First, we had to learn the lessons as a company that kind of, hey, your values are kind of what you do when things are tough and things are hard. And then we wrote them down, and we had 13 values. And that was a bad omen because most people only could remember 2 or 3 values without looking at the page. So there were too many. So with my CEO coach, I started kind of bundling the values up in bigger concepts. And that's how we arrived at the 6 values we have today.
So how early in the company were those values derived? You said they weren't documented at the beginning, but for many, including myself and those outside of the company, it seems that documentation has been core to GitLab from the very, very start. So I'm curious when the light bulb went off that we should actually document these.
Yeah, I'm not sure. We should look at the Git history of our value page, but some of the values happened over time. For example, the iteration value came about during our time at Y Combinator. So in the beginning, we didn't have certain values because we haven't learned those lessons yet.
Interesting. So sometimes values actually come from lessons learned. It's not like you saw all of them in advance.
No, exactly. It's they are written in kind of the scars of working.
Understood. So the top level values, so I'll read those out, and I'm also going to link them in the YouTube description. But the top level values right now are collaboration, results, efficiency, diversity and inclusion, iteration, and transparency. And so together they spell credit. And in our handbook page, we say that we give each other these by assuming good intent. And those top level values, they seem like words that you may hear at other companies. If you looked at a lot of other companies, what their values are, you may see some of those. But when I joined the sub values, so underneath each of those values, there are sub values. Those seem to really describe and dictate the nuance at GitLab. There are things like short toes and no ego and blameless problem solving. And it's impossible to know everything. I mean, the fact that this is written down, that it's impossible to know everything. When I first read this, it's like, it's incredible that this is formalized, because it's one of those things that everyone knows, but in some places it's taboo to even say that. So do you think the sub value describes the nuance in what makes GitLab unique? Do you agree with that? And how have the sub values evolved over time? Were they also built from the scars of doing business?
Yeah, I think that the sub values came about because we had questions about the values and we talked about them and we came to conclusions and we documented those. And like values of like results and collaboration, like, yeah, that's not really special. Other companies have those same values. And so it's not in the word collaboration, it's how what we derive from that, what make it specific. And so I think we need a framework, that is the credit framework, but those sub values are really our set of values. We try to give them catchy names like short toes, so they're easy to refer to. But that's a substance. Otherwise, if you don't specify values, they're just words, and they're much more open to interpretation, and they're much less useful as like the distributed decision framework they are today.
Yeah, so to some degree, I almost see it like a dictionary where you see that first term collaboration, and then you look at the sub-values to actually define that. So to define what collaboration means within the context of working at GitLab. So
That's
that
an
helps.
excellent analogy.
Well, if you've come from a place where collaboration was a value, but maybe it was twisted to support a certain agenda or only applied in certain instances, if you come here and you see collaboration, but there's no sub-values to define it, you may simply bring along that default definition of collaboration and then try to use that here. So that's an interesting way. I haven't really thought about sub-values as the defining or the defining terms of that overarching term, but
we might even rename sub-values to value definitions. Because I don't think they're different values or subordinate values. I think they're definitions of our values. So I think you bring up a really good point. That's
a good point, because sub-values, there's a connotation there that they're beneath the overarching value, but in practice, they serve to substantiate and give context. It's actually a lot easier to recognize people for living out a sub-value. At least I've seen it's easier to recognize that someone lived out a sub-value sometimes than even the top level value, because it's pretty easy to see blameless problem solving or short toes.
I love it. I love it. The sub is not subordinate, but substantiate. I love that.
Right. I'm duly noted. I'm going to make a note to make an MR and see if we can make an iteration on that. It's like iteration inception. We're going to iterate the iterate.
Oh my goodness.
So let me, I want to just go back a bit to your answer there. You said we discussed what the sub values should be to substantiate what the overarching value terms were. How long ago was that? Who was the we? Everyone at GitLab has the ability to make a proposal to change or add to a value. I'm just curious who the we you're referring to is in that instance.
Yeah. So what many companies do is they say, oh, we're going to define our values. They go work on it for a week. They define it, and that's it. That's not how GitLab works. We never had this, oh, let's work on our values for a couple of hours or a couple of days. They've, like everything at GitLab, we iterated on them, and they continually improve, and you still see sub-values being added by people. So there was not this big values conference or something else that we did. They evolved over time, and mostly we wrote down things that we were already doing.
Yeah, that's important. I've spoken with others outside of GitLab, and one of the things they struggle wrapping their mind around is that values or things related to a handbook don't have to be this one and done thing. So a lot of people get anxiety of, oh, I have to have everything packaged up. So on the first of the year, we can email this out to the company, and this is what's going to stand until we do another kind of annual review of something like that. And I just think that's the wrong approach to looking at values, because it's impossible to know everything. So you don't know if what you write down leading into the new year is actually going to be fully applicable throughout the course.
Yeah, for example, we have our OKRs, but we'd be happy to change an OKR throughout the quarter if it's no longer relevant.
Yeah, agreed. So I want to dive into the biggest risks of the company. So we publish what we perceive as the biggest risks to GitLab, and the loss of the values that bind us as a company is actually in that biggest risk list. And so we're working to surface these values as early as possible to applicants, and we've moved it up high in the onboarding issue, and we've created additional handbook pages to kind of really reinforce that reading through the values and ingesting them is not something that should be viewed as skippable. So if you come in and you're onboarding into a new company, it may seem like, oh yeah, the values page, like I just know where it's at. I'll go reference it when crisis hits and I really need it. But we want to make it obvious to people that it's something you really need to dive into and ingest, because it's actually dramatically different, most likely, than where you've come from. I'm just curious on what the thought there is on losing the values that bind us. Like as we scale as a company, tons of new people are coming in every single week. what does the risk look like if people don't rally around these values, or they just bring in old values and try to mix those in with what we have going on here?
Yeah, I think you lose that ability to coordinate. For example, take iteration. If one person is iterating and they have a really minimal, ugly feature they want to add, and the other person comes from another company and says, well, this is nowhere near finished. We need more UX, we need more this. And the other person's like, well, you're right. This needs more work, but we can ship this. It's right now, customers don't have anything. It's not confusing anyone. It's not a security or a data risk or anything else. I agree, it needs more work, but let's get this out and see where people want to take this from here. If the other person is not familiar with iteration, they're going to have a conflict. And it's not that one is better than the other. Like at Stripe, they ship beautiful finished products, and very competent people work there. It's just not how we work. So you set the company up for a lot of conflict if you don't have shared values.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's not about right or wrong necessarily. It's just about committing to doing it one way or the other. I'm curious at what we can do as a company to, after onboarding, to ensure that people are reminded of things like you just mentioned. Is it simply managers living it out and bringing them up on a day-to-day basis? I mean, it seems like the simple answer is just keep living it. But I don't know if there's anything beyond that.
Your values are what you hire for, what you praise people for, and what you promote them for. By definition, what you do there are your values. Not what you say they are, not all the other stuff we do for our values. What we do there is the most crucial. So values, I think, should be explicitly part of our hiring process and our job profiles and our 360s. They are already part, like in the thank you channel, we have the emojis. We don't want to change them to emojis that are available everywhere. We can use them not only in Slack.
Right.
When we give a bonus, it's always linked to the values. And when we do a promotion, it's always linked to the values. I think that's the crucial thing. If you reinforce them there, that's the most powerful thing we can do.
Yeah. Well, what gets measured gets results. And so having the foresight to measure values or make values a part of a 360 review or annual review process is a good way to not get people to skip over them. Because I think in many companies, values are one of those nice to haves, but at the end of the day, it's all about a certain metric at the expense potentially of everything else. And so I think we need to be careful to not fall into that, because a lot of other companies probably have great intentions with values and then get pushed to a certain point where the values get sacrificed for the sake of some other metric. Do you feel that all of the departments at GitLab have an equal opportunity to internalize the values, especially early on? And so the example that came up in questions was for sales, for example, which may be compensated based on quota versus a flat salary. They may come into an organization and feel pressure to jump straight into selling because it's directly tied back to their personal compensation. How do we reconcile
that? I do think that all departments have that opportunity. And in sales, there is that pressure of a quota. And that's why we ramp that quota up gradually and give you the chance to spend time on onboarding yourself and studying everything. You don't start off with 100% quota. It ramps up over time. And that's based on our experience with people that took the time to study. If you want to go fast and become really great at something, you do have to study the materials.
Yeah, understood. So I was personally shocked at some of the values when I joined. And to be totally frank, some of them felt like traps. And I think embracing GitLab values actually could get you blackballed or reprimanded or even terminated at other organizations. I've actually seen the conflict, other ways of working versus the way GitLab works. So it's jarring in all the best ways. But how do we ensure that people give themselves permission to drop any prior organizational baggage that they may have and embrace a fresh start and new values and trust that these values aren't traps and that people actually assume positive intent and they want to rally around them I think for a lot of people, there's an internal battle on, I see these values, I appreciate these values, I want these values to be real, but my prior experience says that that might not serve me in the best possible way.
Was there a value where you were particularly concerned about or suspicious of?
I think some of them are short toes was a good one, and allowing other people to contribute to your domain. So stay in your lane is a very popular corporate term. And if you veer too far into someone else's lane, there can be consequences for that. But here, people genuinely want others to add insights and contributions to make them better. But that can feel at odds with where they may have come from.
Yeah, I think the best way we can show that is by talking about it. It's great that you bring it up, but also through transparency. And I think, for example, our issue tracker is a really powerful way to show, like, yeah, there's really everyone in the organization giving opinions on things. And maybe in short toes, we can link that merge request where I wanted to rename team member to Tanuki, and I got voted down 40-0, and things like that, where, yeah, here are people helping out, giving suggestions. Oh, and here's an example of a person completely not responding to any suggestion made and just making a decision. And that's okay too.
Right.
Because the only way that works, everyone can contribute. The only way it works if we also respect that people take a different decision than what we suggested. That's the magic that makes it work. Not inviting people to contribute, but not having to convince all of the people who left the suggestion.
Right. What's the recommended approach for speaking up when you feel that values aren't being lived out, or they are simply not being understood, or maybe someone isn't aware of them?
Speak up. Say something in a polite way, like link to the relevant value, the relevant sub-value, quote from it. And if there's disagreement or confusion about the values, feel free to talk about it. If you work at GitLab, you can go to our values channel. If you don't work at GitLab, you can mention us on Twitter or myself on Twitter. So yeah, talk about them. And almost every time we face a hard decision at GitLab, it's because values are in conflict. And so it's not binary logic. It will require conversation, and sometimes there's no obvious answer. We can only get there by respectfully talking with each other, discussing, and then having the DRI make a decision.
One of the things that I had a bit of conflict with is we have a Slack channel dedicated to values. And in hearing that answer, I think, oh, it would be kind of amazing if two people are having a discussion or maybe a disagreement on how a certain value is being applied, to just port that argument or disagreement or conversation into the values channel and see if other people have insights to it. But also we say that anything negative should be kept to a smaller group as possible, preferably one-on-one. So if it's veering negative, but it's also applied to values, is there a clear answer on where that should be discussed?
I think negative feedback, not anything negative. We deal with negative all the time at GitLab. There's so many bugs in the product. There's so many, almost if it's not a problem, then why are we discussing it? We shouldn't be discussing anything that isn't a problem. So everything is broken all the time. We just try to fix it. So we deal with negativity a lot. That's also part of our ambition. If you want to get better, you talk about what you can improve. So we're totally allowed to discuss negative things. We're just not allowed to give negative feedback in a big setting if it could also be easily done in a smaller setting. And feedback is about, there's a difference between, Darren, I disagree with you. I really think your door is purple. That's totally fine. It's not positive that we disagree on the color of your door or something much more substantial, but that's different than, Darren, I think I asked you to study the values page and you still haven't done so. And I'm losing confidence in your ability to follow up on things we agree to. That's
Right.
negative feedback, which is very
Right.
different from like a conversation about like, I don't know whether we should do this discount or not.
Yeah, I think that's actually an important distinction, that it almost feels like conflict or things that may involve negativity are still completely fine to be discussed out in the open
For
transparently so you
sure.
can get input. But it's the negative feedback, person specifically giving feedback to another person, where you would want to take that to a private channel. That's a good change. I'm going to go take a look at the handbook page and see if because that wasn't super clear to me. So I'm going to see if there's anything we can do there. I think maybe using the term conflict, like conflict is fine to talk about in public. And I think that could free people up to feel freer to discuss things like this in a public channel.
I think disagreements instead of conflict, because
Okay,
a disagreement is about substance, it's about the work. A conflict very frequently is between two people.
Okay.
So
Okay.
should we go left or right? That's not a conflict, that's a disagreement.
Got it.
Do I still enjoy working with you or not? If I no longer enjoy working with you, that's a conflict. So I don't think we encourage conflict. I think we encourage disagreeing.
Makes sense. So many of the values, in my opinion, they seem to express a desire to not pass judgment on colleagues. And in other organizations, I've seen that a lack of perfection could lead to reprimand. Like to your point, Stripe insists on shipping perfect products. So there are a lot of companies that's simply the way they work. But in some organizations, if you don't ship something that's perfect, then you get judged. But at GitLab, we want you to ship smaller things. So that's kind of it's a big mindset shift for a lot of people. So my question is it intentional that GitLab's values promote a less judgmental and more trusting atmosphere?
I think with GitLab, we also want to do a good job. I want every feature page on our site to look like the Stripe feature pages. So it's not that we want you to do shoddy work. I think what we do want to do is take in account how much time someone spent. If you spent a week developing that page, I'm going to evaluate it completely different than if you spent 9 months. And what we encourage you to do is to ship it after a week, whatever you have. And then if you still want to work on it, improve it, instead of not shipping the page for 9 months. But in the end, we kind of expect you to, if you spend an equal amount of time of it, if you do it in another company, we expect an equal or even better output.
So do you think that there's it's in the fabric or the DNA of the values to be less judgmental and more trusting, or is that simply a byproduct of we encourage people to work on shorter timescales, therefore the expectations are lower?
Yeah, I wouldn't say GitLab is a company of low expectations. I think GitLab is a company of very high expectations. But we do explicitly acknowledge that there's a time, like how much effort you put into it. So if you had less time for it, obviously you can do the same amount of work in a shorter time. So that's I think how far I would go. I think we work in a very high expectation environment. Results is our number one value, where we don't evaluate you by how many hours you put in. We evaluate you by how much calendar time has passed and what the result was.
For me, I think the nugget there was when you mentioned that if you have a shorter time scale to do something, then obviously the expectations of what will come from it in that time scale are different. And I think at some organizations, it's, well, we want the 9-month product, but in a week. And thus the conflict on the person trying to do the work is, how do I get a 9-month project shipped in a week? And the difference here is, you had a week to do it. That's a realistic expectation of what's going to come from that amount of work in a week, and then you can iterate on it. So I think for me, at least, that's kind of the difference there. Why do you think more companies don't, or maybe they do? Do other companies have the MVC mindset, or are most companies looking for longer term, only ship things that are perfect and polished? My impression is that GitLab is one of the few. We're the exception, not the norm, but maybe I just haven't looked around enough.
I think companies do the MVC thing sometimes internally, where they quickly iterate every week they have a sprint and they present the demo. The really hard thing about iteration, it's not an iteration if you change something or improve something. It has to go to the end user. And that requires a lot of comfort with having the user see things that are obvious that there's still improvements possible. And we do that in the belief that the user is going to provide the best feedback. So do you want feedback from like the demo and the people who already thought about it, or your coworkers, or do you want it from the user? We want the feedback from the user, and we're prepared to live with the low level of shame that comes with shipping something that isn't up to where we eventually want it yet.
Yeah, it's a good point. And low level of shame is another one of those sub values that it means a lot to me. I'll make sure to link that in the YouTube description. And speaking of links, I'll also add one to GitLab's values hierarchy. And I'm curious if that exists to resolve disputes when two or more values could be argued to support two different outcomes.
Yes. Eric Johnson made it, our VP of engineering, and it is an attempt to resolve at least some of the tension that is there. Now, it's not absolute. Like you could have something that like would be if you think of values as some logic binary thing, that's not going to work. There's always going to be interpretation, and there's always a magnitude of certain things. But we did make a hierarchy, like to make sure that it's clear in the end the result matters most. Like we're not gonna be transparent just for the sake of being transparent. People talk about radical transparency a lot. We're not radical in our transparency. We do it because we think it will lead to better outcomes. And as soon as it doesn't, we're not going to be transparent about it. And I think those kind of hierarchies are just really important. They will not preempt every debate, but it helps. It helps with the right mindset, and it in 80% of the cases, it's less debate about when two values are in conflict.
Do you have a desire to see other companies copy or implement GitLab's values, even like maybe verbatim or kind of riff on them? And have you seen any companies do that?
They're very welcome to. It's Creative Commons. You can verbatim copy them. I think we'll see people start companies after GitLab that will start with just verbatim taking our values and then improving on them. I would love for other companies that took part of our values to contribute their improvements back to us. I bet there's sub-values other people are developing that we haven't seen. And I know of a few companies that verbatim copied our values as a starting point, and we very much encourage people to.
I'm curious if investors or any other outside parties, if they've remarked on our values in meaningful ways, or do you have any anecdotes there where people have come to you and said a certain thing? Maybe your values have influenced a certain thing, or it brought up a certain discussion. I'm just kind of curious how far and wide they've gone.
They've gone pretty far and wide. I think a lot of people report that they've looked at a certain section of our handbook and they forwarded it to colleagues, and they did that like 5 times, and then they were like, well, I better just join GitLab because that I can work directly with it. I don't have to convince my colleagues first that this is how you should run a marketing campaign or something like that. Especially our compensation calculator is getting pretty popular, where people say, oh, we pay according to the GitLab compensation calculator. The best investor feedback I had is, I think, a tweet from Billy Ilchev that he almost had a heart attack when he saw that we published our OKRs again. And he's like, yeah, it's so strange. Like companies guard these things very, very closely. And then so strange with GitLab seeing them out there in the open, but he recognized it really helps us in various ways, including attracting the best talent to realize those OKRs.
Yeah, I'm actually curious, do you see most other companies publishing their values? Now that I think about it, I'm not sure that many companies do that. We were actually having this conversation earlier where when you think about applying for a company, it's a bit odd that their strategy and I guess sometimes their values are all internal. And it's one of those things that you don't have a full grasp on until you start working there, which kind of makes no sense because you don't know if you're going to be fully aligned.
They ask you to write a blank check. Come join our organization. And when you're in the organization, you need to subscribe to our values, our way of working, and our strategy. It's really important that you do that. And it's very essential. And it's part of our identity and how we work. But they don't give you the opportunity up front to evaluate it. It doesn't make any sense to me. If it's so important that people share your values, have them out there. I bet there's a ton of people who look at GitLab and say, what, iteration, low level of shame? I'm going to apply at Stripe. I want to make something beautiful. I want to ship something beautiful. You can make something beautiful at GitLab, just that the first iteration won't be that. And that's totally cool. Like, we don't need the entire world to work here. And the same with our strategy. I bet there's people who look at our strategy and say, that's nuts. And that's way too much growth. And they're never going to make it. And what are they doing competing with GitHub? And that's fine. Like, but give people the chance. Don't ask your future team members to write a blank check when they apply.
So if you think that values could be one of those things that because we make them public, if people see them and they disagree with them or they don't think they could align with them, so they choose to go apply somewhere else, does it work the other way around where people that do apply, the people that do make their way through and start working here, is there an expectation that since these were public, we expect you to have a level of understanding and actually live those out from the get-go?
When we make you an offer, we tell you in the offer letter, we expect you to share these values. So otherwise, don't accept our offer.
Right. Yeah.
And hopefully way before the offer letter, the values already came up. And I think they come up in many, many interviews.
Yeah, I've seen them just in a lot of applications where people will specifically cite those because it's their day-to-day work is somewhat, you can't possibly know what your day-to-day tasks are going to look like in a year or 2 or 3 in the actual granular things you do. But the values, the foundation of the work environment is something that you can count on. So it's something that people place a high degree of value on. I've been asked if there are new ways to reinforce our values. I mean, we kind of touched on this earlier where it's living it out and saying thanks and making sure we make this public and we praise and promote based on that. But if a team member has a proposal for a new way to reinforce values or an evolution on values, is it as simple as making a merge request on the values page? Are there anything else that you think may be more innovative that we should be thinking about, new ways to live out and reinforce our values on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, I think now we have 11 ways to reinforce our value, and I look forward to 20 ways in a couple of years from now. And that's only going to happen because people make merge requests and share them, Twitter, Slack. Please mention me. And I think there's a ton more ways we can do it that we haven't discovered yet. The only thing I can think of, let's switch those custom emojis for default emojis so we can use them on any platform. But there must be many more ways to reinforce our values.
Well, that's all the questions I had. So did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I thought this was well done. Thanks for running this interview. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And for those viewing, we hope to take this far and wide. And this is just a first iteration on teaching and reinforcing company values and culture as GitLab scale. So stay tuned for more. Thanks, Sid.
Thanks.